All right, we're going to get started. So welcome everyone. I'm just going to give a very, very quick introduction to what's happening here and to who am I. So welcome to the Computer Science Department at the University of Chicago. My name is Pedro Lopes. I'm one of the faculty members that works in areas adjacent to human-computer interaction. And today we're we're recording a meeting that we have about HCI where we invite our students. It's called the HCI Club. We invite our students to come and engage with us, faculty that kind of do related topics with HCI. And we were using it to do this Chicago Symposium where all our students that had accepted papers in this Chi 2020, the premier venue for HCI that unfortunately got canceled due to this whole COVID thing, they get this chance to come and present their full talks and hear questions from you, engage with you, and engage with each other too. I'm very excited. We already have 50 people on the line and we have many more watching from the YouTube. We'll try to pull questions from the YouTube too. But if you're here on the Zoom, you have prime time to just ask questions by putting them on the chat or raising hands, and the session host will try to watch out for that and let you ask your questions or repeat your questions in case you put them in the chat. If you could just raise your hand and ask them yourselves, that's even better. So again, you probably can see everyone. We're going to have 8 talks and 3 sessions. The sessions will be chaired by faculty members in our areas that are related to HCI. I'll introduce them in a second. But before that, I also wanted to give a special welcome to Sarah Sivo. I think she's on the line. Sarah, are you on the line? Can you hear us?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, cool. So Sarah's a new faculty in our department. Hey, Sarah. And if you're a student, we're super happy to have you. If you're a student of UChicago trying to get into HCI and especially into human-robot interaction, you should check out the work that Sarah's been doing. She's amazing, and her work's truly amazing. And you can even chat with her right here on the Zoom chat. Jumping directly into what's going to happen today, we have 8 papers split into 3 sessions. The first session is going to be chaired by Ben Zhao. This is a session on illusions and mirages. Second session is on detection, a lot of privacy heavy session, and of course is chaired by one of our privacy masters, Blaise Ur. And the session number 3, the closing session, also handed out by one of our privacy masters, is on privacy and ads, and that's by Marsh Nichetti, who you already had a chance to see on Zoom here today. So all these folks are around after the talks as well in case you want to engage more with them. And then without further ado, let's start. I'll hand this off to Ben Zhao, who's going to lead us into the first session called Illusions and Mirages. All right, Ben, you have the floor.
All right, great. Thanks, Pedro. So again, a nice warm welcome to all of you. If you're in Chicago, you'll see the weather today is not too far away from Hawaii, although, we're not getting there the palm trees or the ambience, but we're going to do our best to try to reproduce the atmosphere. Welcome to all of you, and then also special welcome to Sarah. Welcome. So yes, let's get the show started. I think I'm chairing the first session, and up first we're going to have Jazz Brooks giving a talk on. I still have trouble pronouncing this word. Pedro, and Jazz, you can correct me if I'm butchering this. Is Trigeminal-based temperature illusions. This stuff is crazy. When I first heard Pedro and Jazz were working on this, I was like, this is insane. But this is the stuff that has real impact. So also Chi Best Paper Award this year. So Jazz, can you unmute yourself? Oh, there you go. Okay. Jazz is a PhD student here, working with Pedro. Yeah, Jazz, take it away.
Okay. So let me just go ahead and share my screen. And hopefully things are actually functioning correctly. All good? I'll assume so. So hi everyone, my name is Jazz Brooks, and today I'll be talking about how to create sensitive temperature changes using a special nerve in our body called the trigeminal nerve. So this work was done in collaboration with my colleague Stephen Noggles and my advisor Pedro Lopes at the University of Chicago. And I'd also like to start by thanking the Chi community for receiving the Best Paper Award. We're really honored by the recognition. So I'll be talking about how this person is actually feeling the temperature in the virtual scene using a very low-powered device that we built specifically for that effect. Now, this work is motivated by how virtual reality has become increasingly realistic. Here I whipped up two scenes fairly quickly that are already pretty photorealistic here. In addition to kind of like visual realism, industry and researchers have also been exploring other modes of realism for virtual reality, such as touch, force feedback, rendering odors in some cases, or even rendering the temperature of virtual scenes. In fact, I'm going to be covering right now how researchers have begun creating this kind of thermal feedback in virtual reality for consumer headsets in particular. Now, the most straightforward approach to do this is using something called heat lamps or air conditioning units. I think most people are familiar with that, to change a large volume of air's temperature. And this kind of structure can be found in things like custom VR arcades like the VR Sense. However, these devices usually require a lot of power and end up being big, which usually runs contrary to what the commercial VR industry is running towards, which is untethered devices. In fact, VR's biggest promise is small home setups or portable systems like the Oculus Go that you see on the left, or more recently, the Oculus Quest that's on the right. In the end, it's really about giving users mobility and staying untethered. Now, researchers have actually started miniaturizing this kind of thermal feedback using things called thermoelectric materials, aka Peltier elements for most people's common knowledge. And what's nice about these is that they can be really small. Essentially, when you pass a current through it, it creates a temperature difference across the surface. So one side gets hot and the other one gets cold. Unfortunately, to sustain that temperature difference, you need an equivalent sum of power, and that can get pretty costly quite quickly. And that means that these devices are going to be small, but usually remain tethered. So if we take something like the Thermo VR system, which is based on Seto and Miyamoto's method of fast temperature switching, to create a 10-minute full frontal cold sensation using this device, you'll have to turn on 10 Peltier elements, cool down the skin by -3 degrees Celsius on each one. And in a worst case scenario, each of these Peltier elements are going to take 0.5 amp hours. That means that the whole thing's going to take about 5 amp hours. And that's about 1.5 times your phone's battery life. So, whoops, sorry. So our goal is kind of looking at whether or not we can bypass that need for a lot of power. And that kind of means that we have to not address this problem with a solution bounded by physics. To do that, we instead looked at a thermal illusion that relies on chemically actuating our senses. And for that, we especially focused on the chemical systems and the chemical senses in the head, especially the ones in our nose. Now, most people are probably familiar with things like the tongue, which is going to taste things, or the olfactory bulb to smell stuff. But there's actually a third thing in your head called the trigeminal nerve. And most people actually associate it to the first two things. So when you're eating or smelling, this kind of nerve sensations are recognizable when you're experiencing bubbly, spicy, sparkly, or refreshing things. Now, what's interesting about this nerve is that it responds to mechanical deformation, as well as having receptors that respond specifically to temperature changes. So let's take Chicago, for example, if it was the winter. Now, if you walk outside and it's -10 degrees Celsius, that refreshing feeling that you have when you breathe in, the crispness, that's in fact your trigeminal nerve that's responding. The trick is that the receptors are responding to the temperature change of the tissue. And these receptors not only respond to temperature, but also respond to chemical stimuli, which begs the question, maybe we can elicit these kinds of sensations with only chemicals. For this, we actually looked at two specific receptors, and these are called transient receptor cation channels. TRPV1, which is temperature gated by hot temperatures, so 45 degrees Celsius and above about, and then TRPM8, it's like a cold receptor, so gated by temperatures 25 degrees Celsius and below. Now, remember, this is temperature of your tissue, and that's pretty cold for your body if you're going to go down to 25 degrees Celsius, or really hot when you get to 45 degrees Celsius. Now, what's of interest with these is that you can actuate them with extracts that are commonly found in plants. For example, capsaicin in peppers or menthol that's in mint. In our case, what we were interested in was looking at whether we can just use like readily available essential oils as well as easily accessible chemical compounds to create the solution. So to do that, the first step we had to do was implement a prototype thermal display. Now, in fact, in our case, what we did was create an untitled olfactory display. So here you're going to see like a phone actuating it wirelessly. And the device includes a Bluetooth microcontroller for that wireless communication, a set of micropumps to actually pump around the chemical compounds, 1 milliliter reservoirs, 3 of them in this case, and then a mesh atomizer to create a fine mist. Now, what this allows us to do is do things like emit capsaicin to create a warming sensation. And that's pretty easily done by just pumping some of the capsaicin compound from one reservoir out to the mesh will create the aerosol. Similarly, we can do things like emit eucalyptal to create kind of like a cooling sensation for people. Or, and this is fun, actually do mixtures. So we could do like capsaicin plus a smell, like a floral odor, for example. Now, when we're designing the device itself, we had to address 2 specific problems that were going to arise. The first was that capsaicin doesn't evaporate at the same temperature as alcohol. In fact, it needs a really high temperature for that to happen. So we couldn't end up using something like evaporation to actually deliver the compound. Instead, we have to keep everything in liquid phase. To do that, we use something called a vibrating mesh transducer, which has a bunch of like tiny holes, and that creates an aerosol of like fine, tiny droplets. That means that we can just like, atomize suspensions or keep everything liquid phase that gets to the nose as it is. So capsaicin was able to be atomized. Second, because we're only using one atomizer and we have multiple channels of liquids, in this case 3, it really becomes paramount to try and reduce cross-contamination. In other words, we just want the selective channel to be outputted. So in our case, to try and avoid this, we actually made sure that each of the channels had their own separate reservoir, set of tubing, and micropump. But on top of that, we actually added something called a capillary tube to the end of each channel. Now, what this does is constrict the flow a lot so that there's a high surface tension in the liquid. And when the micropump actually creates a droplet, the droplet gets picked up really quickly by the vibrating mesh transducer and gets aerosolized. On top of that, when you have these capillary tubes, it's really hard for backflow to happen. So if one channel outputs and then the other one's, it like kind of like covers another channel, it doesn't like flow back into the channel's tubing. This means that we can actually only do mixture at the point of atomization and further reduce any kind of potential cross-contamination that might be happening. Now, the last thing that we ended up doing in this case, I think it's going to play, I think it just needs one more, was make the actual reservoirs easily accessible so that people could quickly remove a reservoir, swap out a compound, or even do refilling in this case. Now, what's interesting about this device is that when you're rendering temperature with it, it only requires 0.25 watts, which, as we saw, sometimes these Peltier elements can actually cost 50 times more, and that's a stark contrast. So in our first study, we had to actually determine what would be the best candidates for these kinds of sensations. So we searched for compounds in medical and olfactory literature that could be easily used in a VR experience, and selected 6 candidates that can be diluted with ethanol. So in this case, we have 3 warm candidates that were selected for activation of warm TRP channels, including thymol, cayenne pepper tincture, which in this case I'll be referring to as capsaicin, because that's what we ended up using for our capsaicin condition, and methyl salicylate, as well as 3 additional compounds for their activation of cool TRP channels, including linalool, eucalyptal, and peppermint essential oil, of which the last one has a large concentration of menthol. Of note is that 2 of these compounds, methyl salicylate and linalool, activated a combination of both cool and warm TRP channels. Now, to verify that these compounds are contributing to the temperature sensation that we're getting, we ended up using the solvent as a baseline. So the only difference between the baseline and any of these candidates is the trigeminal stimulant being added, such the chemical compound. And participants were asked to inhale about 1 microliter of each compound, and were asked to then rate the perceived temperature. So the first thing that we ended up seeing was that linalool and methyl salicylate both elicited a wide range of temperature sensations, and that lines up with how they both activate hot and cold TRP channels. Then we found that peppermint essential oil and thymol actually elicited the strongest temperature sensations for participants. The downside for these was that not only could people smell them, but they were able to identify them. So that means you could tell if there's an odor there, and then you can be like, ah, yeah, this is minty, like peppermint essential oil. Unfortunately, like in contrast, what we're looking for are compounds that optimize 2 aspects. 1, that they elicit the temperature sensation, and then 2, they don't break the illusion by suddenly being recognized as a particular odor. Luckily, eucalyptal and capsaicin satisfy these criteria. So most participants were not able to identify eucalyptal, even though they could smell it. And on the other side of the spectrum, participants couldn't distinguish capsaicin from the baseline, in part because capsaicin on its own is an odorless compound. Of interest in all this is that participants were able to do these distinguish all these candidates with only tiny 1 microliter volumes. That's really small. So that meant we could use small quantities of eucalyptal and capsaicin to then test the temperature illusion in virtual reality. For that, we placed participants in a VR environment that either had a temperature congruent stimulant or the baseline solvent. In this case, for example, the cold mountain would have menthol as eucalyptal as its temperature congruent trigeminal stimulant, or in the baseline case, just the ethanol. Turns out participants were able to feel significantly warmer or colder with the stimulants than without them. And that really confirmed that the temperature illusion held up with visually congruent information in virtual reality. So here you can see that for the cold mountain, they felt much colder with the eucalyptal, and for the desert, they actually felt warmer with the capsaicin solution. So we took all this together and put it with our prototype and created a VR scene demonstrating the full experience, which I'm going to walk people through, partially because there's no audio, I think. So here are the users in the cabin in the woods, warming up next to a furnace. And to render that warm sensation, we actually emit capsaicin, which activates the TRPV1 channel in the trigeminal nerve, and is an odorless warming sensation. Warm right now. And then, because there's a storm, power goes out, and all is swung open, so it gets pretty cold. And we start emitting eucalyptal instead to activate the TRPM8 channel of the trigeminal nerve and create that cooling sensation. Now, because it's cold and the person doesn't want to stay cold, you're going to go outside and look for the emergency electricity generator. Because it's colder outside, we actually emit eucalyptal more frequently to create a colder sensation. I finally get to the emergency generator, switch it on, and because there's a little bit of warmth coming from it, we're going to emit capsaicin again. But we don't just do that, we actually throw in even a little bit of a rubbery odor to create kind of a sensation of a burning fuel smell. So here, we're not just doing temperature rendering, we're also kicking in olfactory rendering. Now that the power's on, go back inside. On our way in, close the door. At which point we stop the eucalyptal, since there's no more cold air, and kick back in the capsaicin. At which point they can go back to the furnace and just warm up. Now, to conclude, we introduced a new way to create temperature changes in VR using an illusion. In fact, the illusion is about 52 times more efficient than Peltier's, but it's still an illusion. So the current range of sensation is quite limited. But this provides a venue of research / investigating synthetic compounds that can kind of like activate those receptors even more than the current ones. For example, there's a synthetic compound called isolin for the cold TRPM8 channel that's about 50 times colder than menthol and has no smell. At the moment, the area of effect is localized to the face, but several participants actually mentioned the feeling expanding away from the face and like onto the chest as well, or the rest of the body. The temperature sensation right now is tied actually to the user's inhalation, which makes sense considering it's an odor. But it's also a situation where users might unconsciously adjust their breathing to minimize exposure to certain compounds. At the moment, the device also relies on reservoirs, where each reservoir has a maximum capacity of about 2 hours or so, which isn't too bad. And the battery life actually lasts even longer than the reservoirs. However, it's worth noting that this actually provides a pretty easy upgrade for any existing olfactory displays to allow them to render not only smells, but also temperatures without having to expend any additional energy. And this applies not only to VR contexts, but also mobile and AR contexts. Finally, while it's a promising illusion, we're pretty keen on exploring how we can expand this temperature illusion beyond the nose, and that might actually offer richer temperature experiences for virtual reality. So I'd want to acknowledge my co-authors again, Stephen Noggles and my advisor, Pedro Lopes. And thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions at this point, though I don't really know where to look for the questions. I'll assume Ben's going to say something. Sorry.
Yes, thanks, Jess. That was a very cool talk. That's the first time I've seen that talk. I still had to run down to your lab at some point and strap one of these things on. This would be awesome. Yeah, so we already have some questions coming in. If you have questions, please, click on the participants tab and then raise your hand or use one of those icons to indicate that you have a question, and then we'll unmute you to so that you can ask your question. We already have a few questions coming in, so I'm going to try to get to those first. So Jazz, I think you're going to have a lot of questions, but all right. So first question from actually YouTube. One common complaint of VR is that headsets get hot and sweaty. The technology is fascinating and more immersion is always a good goal, but do consumers actually want to experience more heat in VR?
Yeah, that's actually a good question. I think it depends on the situation. I think there's something very interesting about like thermal realism, and especially this kind of illusion, because you might not always have like a strong reaction, is might be like the nice thing about this, not necessarily always sweating. And I think a lot of the participants that actually did the VR one responded quite positively, especially for the cool sensations in virtual reality. And in the paper, I think it brings this up. They all rated like enjoying it more with that cooling sensation. I think most people it's conflicting whether they'll enjoy being like warmed up. I'm personally someone who enjoys being cool most of the time. So I don't know if that answers that question very well.
Excellent. Yeah, we're going to have to, go through these. Okay. We have a question from Roshan, who's active on the Zoom. Roshan, I believe I've unmuted you. Please feel free to jump in with your question.
Hi, Jess. It's really great work. I was just typing in my question as well, but I think one of the other advantages of this work is that it's also a contactless way to deliver thermal sensations, which is quite difficult with if you have Peltier modules and such. So I was just wondering, did the participants feel any of these delivery mechanisms, like a bit of wind or like kind of droplets on the nose, because the nose is kind of the most sensitive part?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So when we were adjusting the quantities that were being emitted, if it was too much, so this is like what in the earlier kind of like pilots, if there's a lot of atomization happening, they'll actually feel a wetness or the atomization itself. But if you regulate it to about the quantities that we had in the paper, they don't feel it. And you can even lower it even more where they don't, it feels kind of like sudden changes. So that tactile aspect can disappear.
Great. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Roshan. A question from Sarah Sibo. You show examples where the different compounds to simulate feelings hot and cold are given in quick succession when turning on the emergency power box. How long do the effects of each of the compounds last? And can this quick switching be influenced by any carryover effects from the compounds with contrasting effects?
That's a fantastic question, and one that's still on my mind right now. So we didn't actually investigate kind of like how quickly switches can happen. You can notice them pretty fast just from like anecdotal experience. I think one of the concerns it would be is generally just that you're actuating these channels separately compared to like warming or cooling the skin progressively, where it's like you can do weird things like actuate both the TRPM8 channel and the TRPV1, which is both hot and cold, and have like a really weird reaction to it, not necessarily thermal grill-esque. But to answer that question more directly, I think we'll have to look at that more in future work. It's in the case of the VR environment, we specifically made it a longer experience so that people can like focus on it more. I think we ended up having it be like a minimum of 2 minutes, but the sensation faded away pretty quickly afterwards. I hope that answers the question completely.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so there are still more questions coming in. I suspect that Jazz will have to field quite a few of these, either online in the Zoom chats or via email. Either way is fine. But let's just take one more before we move on to Andrew. From Uday, let's see, what is he here? I'm sure he is. I need to scroll down this long list of participants and unmute him. Uday I'll just read his question and then he can follow up as he's unmuted now. Let's see, how does room temperature affect this illusion? For example, when a user is in the room temperature of say 30 degrees Celsius, does the cold temperature illusion still work?
Yeah, so we had the same thought. So straight up on the virtual reality and in both of our user studies, we actually maintain the same room temperature just so that there's no effects on this. In previous literature about this, there is interactions between the room temperature itself and the perception of these compounds, in the sense that you can have weird things like capsaicin modulating your ability to perceive like room temperature a bit differently. And it's not as straightforward as controlling like the air temperature, the relationship between like the air temperature and the skin temperature. That's like something that I'm interested in exploring in the future. But yeah, it's not as straightforward as kind of like as just changing the temperature of a tissue. That's an excellent question.
All right, thank you so much, Jess, for that great talk. I think there will be more. There are still already more questions that we didn't even get to. But I think you can see those questions already in chat. I think Rob Mitchum is helping us move over questions from the YouTube channel as he's monitoring that. So yeah, feel free to answer those on the chat channel or do so privately. Either way would be fine. In the meantime, we're going to move to our second talk. Let me get all the information here. Thanks, Jess. So our second talk is from Andrew McNutt, and he is a PhD student also here at UChicago, working with Gordon on visualization-related topics. So let me post his info there. Andrew, I believe you're unmuted and ready to go.
All right. Thanks, Ben.
Okay. No problem. Take it away.
All right. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Everyone see my title slide? Cool. Sorry, a little Zoom clutter. Hi, my name is Andrew McNutt. I'm a third-year PhD student here at University of Chicago. When reading a visualization, is what we see really what we get? There are a lot of ways that visualizations can mislead us to show us something interesting that disappears upon closer inspection. Today, I'm going to be talking about our paper, Surfacing Visualization Mirages, in which we introduce the notion of a visualization mirage, describe the troubles they can cause, and provide a technique based on metamorphic testing to dispel a particularly quarrelsome class of mirages. This work was the product of a collaboration between me and Gordon Kittleman and Michael Carell during my summer internship at Tableau Research. So, what can we say about this humble bar chart? Well, it appears that location B has about 50% more sales than location A. Is the store in location A underperforming? Given the magnitude of the difference, I bet your knee-jerk answer would be yes. Yet, the reality of the situation can be much more complex. Many patterns can hide behind aggregate data. It might have outliers. It might have dirty data. It might have irregular population sizes, or just a whole host of additional problems. Simple aggregations like our humble bar chart are the foundation of many analytics tools, with subsequent analyses often being built on top of these potentially shaky grounds. As we'll discuss, problems like this are endemic to visual analysis, occurring at each stage in the analysis pipeline. What do we do about these problems? Should we stop analyzing data visually? Should we burn our computers? Well, the first step in addressing a problem is to often name it. So we introduced a term for these errors, visualization mirages. We define them to be any visualization where the cursory reading of the visualization would appear to support a particular message arising from the data, but where a closer re-examination would remove or cast significant doubt on the support. We conducted a literature review that yielded 83 different errors, and despite the magnitude of this list, it's not comprehensive. Mirages come from all sorts of places. Mirages arise through visual analytics. They occur as the result of choices made about data. They come from design choices. They depend on what you're trying to do with data or trying to do with visualizations from everywhere. These can come in familiar forms like the outliers shown here, or from overplotting, or the easily recalled availability heuristic, or as well as less familiar ones, such as inappropriate or missing aggregation. For the full details of this list, please see the appendix of our paper. So on the road to making a visualization or chart, there are many steps and stages, each of which are liable to let error in. Consider a simplified pipeline model. An analyst decides how to curate data, how to wrangle it into a usable form, how to visually encode that data, and then finally, how to actually read it. At each moment, when the analyst exercises agency, they create an opportunity for error, and they're in a mirage, which can cascade along this pipeline, creating illusory insights. Let's look at a few concrete examples of where things have gone wrong. Mirages can come from dirty data due to statistical or data entry errors or lots of other places. Something as innocuous as defining the bins of a histogram or other bar chart can mask underlying data quality issues, which might in turn lead to incorrect inferences about a trend. For instance, here it appears that sales are down in the fourth quarter of 2010, yet on closer inspection, we can see that there are several months of missing data driving that insight. Mirages can come from volatile visualizations. That is, those visualizations of charts that don't really reflect changes to their data, or can cause the reader to hallucinate meaning through arbitrary graphical decisions. For instance, arbitrary choices about axis ordering in a radar chart can cause a reader to falsely believe one job candidate is good, while another is lacking. To wit, which of these candidates is better? Answer, neither. They are the same candidate, that only the axis ordering has been changed. Mirages can come from creating visualizations with uncritical or unreflective eye. For instance, decisions about what type of crime actually counts as crime can lead to maps that drive radically different impressions about the role of crime in a particular area. As here, home buying website Trulia gives a radically different depiction of which parts of New York are dangerous compared to a similar map highlighting white-collar crime. So now maybe you're asking yourself, do these mirages really happen? Do they occur in day-to-day life? To motivate this, let's consider a hypothetical analysis session. Say you're curious about the trend of global energy usage over time. A natural way to address these questions would be to fire up Tableau and drop in the World Indicators dataset. The World Indicators dataset consists of various vital world statistics from 2000 to 2012. It's been used for advocacy of lots of different sorts, as well as to understand just the general trajectory of human development. So we can start by visualizing our data as a simple line chart. The trend over time here shows that there was a sharp decrease in 2012. Great, job done. And this would be great news for the environment were it not illusory, as we can see on the right when we actually go to check the set of missing records. Now, if we try to quash these data problems by switching the aggregation in our line chart from sum to mean, we find that the opposite is true. There is a sharp increase from 2000, and there's a sharp increase in 2012. Unfortunately, this conclusion is also a mirage. The only non-null entries for 2012 are OECD countries. These countries have much higher energy usage than other countries across all of these years. Now, given these irregularities, we can try removing 2012 from the data and focus on the gradual upward trend in energy usage in the rest of the data. As you can see on the left, it appears that energy usage is tightly correlated with average life expectancy. Perhaps more power means a happier life for everyone after all. Seems great. Unfortunately, this too is a mirage. The y-axis of this chart has been altered to make the trends appear similar and obscures the fact that energy usage is flat for most countries, with two notable outliers. Now, of course, after seeing that, you're probably saying, I'm very smart and visually literate, and I wouldn't fall for these mirages. Unfortunately, even those with high data visualization literacy make mistakes. Such is the case with this now infamous chart of gun deaths in Florida, which upon first glance appears to show that the stand your ground law actually decreased gun deaths. But on second glance, it actually says the opposite. Gun deaths increased after the stand your ground law. The axis is pointed in the opposite direction from the conventional direction. This is another mirage. There are lots of ways you might be deceived. For instance, visualizations are rhetorical devices that are easy to trust too deeply, which can cause the reader to miss subtleties or to accept questionable conclusions unquestioningly. Sometimes you're just tired and you missed something obvious. So instead of relying on the user to do everything for themselves, we turn to computers for help. Alerting users to mirages is a great way to guide them towards safer visual analytics. Some mirages, like the reversed axes we saw on the previous slide, are easy to detect. You simply query the function creating a visualization directly. Yet, not all problems are so easy to find. Many chart types do not have ready-made guidelines or best practices to guide analysts. Mirages that lie at the intersection of visual encoding and data wrangling stages of our pipeline are much harder to detect. To address this, we turn to metamorphic testing, which is a testing methodology from software engineering that begins with the observation that you can't always test for the correctness of properties directly. That is, test oracles are not always available. In some of these cases, it can be easier to reason about correctness in relationship to changes, that is, over symmetries. Let's put it graphically. This technique begins by finding an example of normal behavior, here labeled example data, messing up that input data in a careful and predetermined way, yielding the modified data, and then feeding it through the system of interest. And finally, comparing the old and new outputs, which yields a binary pass-fail result. It is a test after all. So let's make this concrete. One of my favorite examples of this technique is Donaldson et al.'s graphics fuzz, a metamorphic testing technique for compilers of shader programs, which are a special type of program for creating computer graphics. They start by taking a working shader, as here on the left, and injecting hypothetically dead code into that shader, and then automatically comparing the outputs. And this injection of hypothetically dead code should hypothetically do nothing. But as we can see in these cases, it radically modifies the output. Through this technique, they're able to catch a number of bugs in commercial shader compilers. Pretty good. We can start to apply this model to visualization problems by recalling Kindleman-Scheidegger's algebraic visualization design framework, which asserts, in the language of category theory, a good visualization will change significantly when significant changes to its inputs are made. Similarly, when an insignificant change is made, then there should be, correspondingly, no visual change. And pleasantly, this turns out to be exactly isomorphic to Donaldson et al.'s formulation of metamorphic testing, as shown here on the bottom. And we can combine these into a metamorphic testing for visualization, here written graphically, as well as in pseudo-Haskell. We note that these assertions are parameterized by the way the data is changed, here denoted alpha, the way that the output is modified, denoted omega, and the way that they're compared, EQ for equality. We believe this technique would be effective when used in conjunction with other methods, such as data verification, direct viz verification, and of course, healthy skepticism. To test the validity of this technique, we built a proof of concept system that applied metamorphic testing for visualization to a simple static subset of the VegaLite charting library. VegaLite is a charting library that implements the grammar of graphics through a static and machine-friendly API. This makes it easier for our system to automatically reason about our metamorphic assertions. Now let's see this technique in action. So the order in which you draw dots in a scatter plot shouldn't matter, right? Yet, depending on the data set, it often can. Overplotting data classes or overplotting can erase data classes or can cause false inferences. So we can test for this property by shuffling the order of the input data and then doing a pixel difference between the two images. If the difference is above a certain threshold, we know that there may be a problem. This is the essence of our technique. For a particular data set, execute a change that should have a predictable result, in this case, that there should be no visual change, and compare the results. We can also test via visual changes. For instance, here we expect that if we change the opacity of bars in a bar chart, then we should get roughly the same chart with slightly opaque bars, right? That seems reasonable. Yet, in this case, this assertion fails, revealing a problem. In particular, it reveals that one of the authors, me, of this paper forgot to select an aggregation function. And so all of the bars were simply drawn on top of each other, doing an implicit max aggregation. All this is a fine chart if chosen explicitly. The ambiguity here will likely create a mirage. Testing through data manipulation can be made more effective in some scenarios by taking a statistical view. For instance, here we're investigating whether the insight displayed in our bar chart from the top of the talk is robust. To answer this question, we can bootstrap within our data classes. That is, we can non-parametrically recreate the subset of the data within each mark by sampling with replacement. This will allow us to see if the aggregation ordering is robust. We'll consider two examples. First, we'll look at case A, which looks at the simple case where the marks are each driven by a single point. Okay, so let's execute our bootstraps. Executing the bootstrap, we find that no matter how many resamplings we run, again, because there's only one element per bar, we always find that the bars have the same ordinal relationship. That is, A is always less than B. This suggests that this insight is robust. No test failure. Now let's turn to a second example, case B, where the aggregation here is predominantly driven by an outlier, and then we can now apply our same bootstrapping logic to see if it's robust. And behold, we see the bootstrapping within the marks shows that the insight only held up about 2/3 of the time. This qualifies for us as an assertion failure. This doesn't seem to be a good basis on which to make subsequent decisions. While still in early development, we find that this approach can effectively catch a wide variety of visualization errors that occur when matching encoding to data. The full space of visualization mirages is vast and covers complex ground like critical reasoning, cognitive biases, and inequality. There are some mirages that may never be amenable to testing or verification, especially not in as straightforward a way as issues driven by outliers or sampling error. Visualizations and the people who create them are prone to failure in subtle and difficult ways. We believe that visual analytics systems should do more to protect their users from themselves. We believe that these systems should help their users have justified and accurate confidence in their conclusions. One way these systems can do this is to surface visualization mirages to their users as part of the analytics process, which hopefully will guide users towards a safer and more effective analysis. Applying our metamorphic testing for visualization approach is just one tool in the visualization validation toolbox, though of course there are others, such as direct validating charting specifications. The right interface to effectively convey validations is still unknown. Applying a metaphor of software linting seems like a promising approach. With that, I'll conclude my talk. I'll be happy to take any questions here or on the chat or even more likely probably on the internet. Thanks to Tableau Research for funding this work, and thanks to you for your time and attention.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. That was a very interesting talk. So yes, Zoom clapping. I don't know how that works yet. I'm still trying to figure out the icons. But Zoom applause. So thank you for that talk. Let's see, we have a couple of minutes for questions. Trying to sort through, see if we have any on Zoom yet. If you do have a question or would like to ask a question, please use the hands up button on your Zoom participants panel. and I am trying to scan it. In the meantime, while I'm trying to sort that out, Andrew, I have a question as I was listening to your talk. It seems like some of these problems are more of sort of like a data processing and pre-processing, data cleaning sort of issue. Is there a fine line or is there a clear line that delineates between, issues in data processing and just missing data versus actual visualization things? I think some of the examples that you talked about were very clearly visualization things, like overlapping bars or upside down axes and mislabeled issues like that. Is there a clear line between those? And also, if you were to apply a general technique that accounts for some of these, but not all of these, how do you sort of make it clear that where the line or where the scope of your tool sort of ends?
Those are two wonderful questions. So a kind of crucial thing about the act of visualization is that it kind of is a holistic process. There are, like you say, there are parts. There's visual encoding, and there's also data pre-processing. And when you're taking that action, you are making assumptions and you're making decisions across this process. And sort of while there are sort of these kind of clearly defined subfields like wrangling or encoding. What's more insidious is when these kind of co-occur. Like the language of AVD or algebraic viz is useful because it allows us to talk about the relationship sort of between the data state or like the nature of the data that you have and the way that you're encoding it. So there's not really a clear line, and the reason why we're applying AVD is to try to hopefully sort of deal with that blurred line. And then how do you communicate the boundaries of your analysis? That is incredibly hard. I don't know if there's a known solution yet. There's a paper at Euroviz that's getting presented tomorrow, actually, on visual lint by Hopkins and Co. And they cover some mechanisms for doing a visual lint on top of a chart to tell users have done stuff wrong. But it's not clear how that works. I mean, the way trust works is with visualization is very delicate. Like if you reveal to someone that there's been an error, sometimes they'll just stop trusting your whole system or even just the visualization in total. And that sort of recoil can be really bad if you're trying to help someone do an analysis. So it's a tough question.
Yeah, definitely. That's clearly there's no easy answer to that one. So one of the comments on Zoom chat from Maribel, this is a great validation tool, but I find it more useful for checking others' work. For example, charts presented by the media and other organizations rather than when you are the author. I guess the sort of the implied question here is, how is there a difference between when you are using this tool on external data versus your own? Is there an easier way to apply this to, for example, external sources of data? I think that would be super cool if you were to have some sort of a filter where, when presented with a particular chart or information source, whether it be on some sort of web page or in a paper, that you could automatically run this tool. You could, apply sort of the techniques that you talked about and really point out potentially misleading types of issues.
Yeah, totally. I would really love to see more tools engage with like reproducibility and replicability. And I think having a validation process like this would be a great way to do that. It's hard to do that via the internet because you don't know what data processes the person did ahead of time. Like you don't know what assumptions they made when they're curating their data. Like returning to the crime maps example, you don't know what assumptions they made when they were saying like, oh, this is a crime versus this is not. And those sorts of artifacts would be hard to audit or even really think about. And so, that process, it's unclear if this would even be addressable through our validation process either. Ours is a modest and early stage prototype. We're trying to just open up this sort of automatic perturbations of data in a new way.
Yeah, I mean, just a comment on that. I think this is something that could be potentially incredibly useful and of high impact if there were some version of it that were to be easily applied for external sources, right? In this day and age of sort of misrepresenting data and like as the example that you showed of the Florida crime results, I mean, that would potentially have a huge amount of impact, I think, in non-academic research life. I think that could be super interesting. Okay, all right. Thank you, Andrew, for that great talk. I think there might be more questions on YouTube and chat as we go along. In the meantime, it is time for us to move to our third talk. And this will be given by Pedro. So here you go. That's Pedro's information on the paper as well. Pedro, I probably don't need to say much other than he's one of our young stars here in ACI, and every time I hear about his work, it's simultaneously exciting and just a tad frightening. So super exciting stuff. Pedro, I'll let you take over.
All right, can you all see my screen and hear me? Yeah, I don't see anyone, so I need a verbal acknowledgement.
Yeah, you're good to go.
All right, awesome. All right, so I'll be talking about this reflection paper that I wrote with this group of people that you see here on the slide. These are my co-authors. Too many to name, but they're all amazing people. And we essentially wrote a reflection paper about a paradigm shift in the thinking of interfaces. We think people are, especially researchers in human-computer interaction, are used to thinking about HCI as the study of the interaction between humans and computers. And this perspective of taking the I in HCI as interaction is interesting, but it does come with one cost, which is that it makes us consider users and devices as two separate entities, which I represent here as the user and the device, as these two bubbles. The separation has proven very valuable since the early days of like mainframe computers and interactive computers. In fact, it's what allowed us to move from mainframe computers to actual interactive personal computers by improving the interaction between the user and device, right? This little boundary right there, this frontier between these two bubbles, by optimizing the user device's bandwidth, the ergonomics, and so forth. And so when people tried to start to make these interactions happen everywhere and any time, we all know what happened, right? The form factors shifted, devices became smaller than the users, and that led to mobile devices, essentially putting a device in everyone's pockets. This also fueled a lot of new challenges, such as usability challenges, how to interact with touch modality, how to interact in very small screens, and so forth. But pretty much ended up with us here today in 2020 with a device in everyone's pocket. Now, what's really interesting is that this trend didn't stop right here, but it continued and moved the devices from our pockets into our user's body and in the forms of wearable devices, which, as we know, can be attached to our own body or even embedded into our clothes. And this, again, brought new challenges. How do we interact without looking at the device, so-called eyes-free, in really quick gestures, and so forth. Now, this way of thinking of the letter I in HCI as interaction is very powerful, and I think it draws on the definition of the word itself, communication with something or someone. And that's precisely what we as researchers sort of are optimizing for. We're optimizing for the communication of this between the interface and the user, the speed of this communication, the bandwidth of the communication, and so forth. But today I want to emphasize that there's also a new paradigm, interface paradigm in the horizon just after wearable, and that these devices overlap with the human body to a much larger degree than ever before. And let me exemplify with something that is very close to my own research and to my heart. These are interactive devices based on muscle stimulation. So these have the capability to move the user's muscles involuntarily. As such, one can, for instance, put these electrodes on one's arm and control your muscles, as in transforming your muscles into a display by controlling how you sketch via these involuntary contractions driven by the muscle stimulation. Now, what is really striking here is that the user's muscles became an integral part of the hardware of the device. And that's why we say there's a large overlap between users and device. As a result of this, I think, and my co-authors agree too, that it will be very productive to also think of the letter I in HCI, not just of interaction, but also as of integration. And that this paradigm shift is not just limited to devices that overlap with the user's senses or user's muscles, but even with implanted devices, right? These are devices that are completely inside the user's body, usually medical devices such as pacemakers, RFIDs, but also see that this is bleeding into the interactive devices area. So we think this perspective of integration is very useful to explore the challenges that arise if you consider user and device as one entity. And we'll see that we actually found out precisely a few challenges that arise from that. So that's what we did. We immersed 29 researchers in 5 days in the castle in Germany called Dachstuhl, which is really cool, and I recommend you all to go there, to discuss these grand challenges that come with the concept of integration. We wanted to find out which issues are exacerbated by looking at HCI from the lens of integration rather than interaction, and we clustered these issues in what we thought were grand challenges for the field. These were organized in 4 categories, such as human-compatible technology, identity and behavior, integration with society, and designing for integrated interfaces. Now, I can't go into all of them because this format doesn't allow me to dive into every single one in detail, so let me highlight 2 that I think are very relevant for devices that are very close to the human body. Let me start with biocompatibility. So we're departing from rigid wearable devices that just sit loosely on your skin, and we're diving directly into sticking or attaching devices such as films, electrodes, and so forth, directly into the user's epidermis. What really sets epidermal devices apart from wearables is that they're made to adapt to the user's body shape. And so researchers engineer them using flexible and stretchable materials. Now, sometimes part of the research devices might accomplish this, and here's some of mine on the right side, in fact, but still hide away pieces of electronics that are ultimately comprised of non-stretchable or non-conformable materials. The reason why we thought it's a grand challenge rather than ordinary challenge is that we just don't mean to conform the sensors or the actuators to the body, as is the case here, but to go one step further and conform the complete device to the user's body. And we're start seeing a new range of approaches to this, such as making the devices without a rigid PCB on the left side, or even using stretchable transistors on the right side, actually from Sihong Wang from Chicago. Now, the next type of devices that I'm talking about are placed under the user's epidermis, and therefore are literally under your skin. These are fingertip magnets, RFID implants, and even some interactive devices. And then last, as you move past the skin and into the fat and the tissue, you have truly implanted devices, such as cochlear implants, insulin pumps, and pacemakers. Now, if you look at each of the layer of these stacks, you can identify key challenges for HCI if you think of this lens of integration. So first, devices that are attached to the skin do not require any surgery or complex procedure because they're based on stickers, like the sticky electrodes that I use for muscle stimulation. On the contrary, this means these stickers obstruct your skin. They interfere heavily with your tactile acuity. They diminish your sense of dexterity. And of course, they're not permanent, so researchers keep reapplying them. And this is a key limitation because while these devices are the safest on this list, they only have applications in research right now, where the others actually have commercial deployments. And I find that very, very challenging and interesting. Now, subdermal devices are of a different class. They require small surgical procedures to go under your epidermis. And you can apply permanently simple actuators such as magnets, RFIDs. But as they grow in complexity, such as the device on the right side, which has batteries and LEDs, it's a device by Team Canon, you start to see some of the open challenges. How do you upgrade this device? How do you communicate without cables and open wounds and so forth? And lastly, in the deeper level of implantation, such as pacemakers and so forth, you inherit all the challenges of subdermal devices with an extra level of critical care and need, right? That's biocompatibility of the materials to avoid rejection and the need for serious surgery. They, of course, have the benefits, right? Lifelong permanence, access to organs, and not just a sensory apparatus. That's how a pacemaker regulates your heart function. And they usually don't need any explicit user involvement. These devices just do their thing automatically. So while these are certainly implanted devices, they might not really be interactive implanted devices, as they don't expose an interface for the user to control them. So there's very little agency in having one of these devices. So it's a key open challenge how you might allow your users, or you might design ways for your users to actually control or interact or understand what's going on with these devices. Now, I've talked about challenges down at sort of the intersection of hardware, users' biology, skin, and so forth. But how might these new integrated devices affect users' identity and behavior? So the big open question here is, if you're integrated with a device to a point that, as I just said, maybe it sits inside your body and it's accessed through a very direct means, such as, muscle movements and so forth, what does this do to your sense of self? In other words, if there's an interface paradigm shift towards this concept of integration, is there also a shift in perception of self? And technologies for changing one's perception of self are certainly out there. In fact, virtual reality has been a rather popular means to achieve many of these illusions, such as to shift one's perspective into that of a child with a smaller body by using virtual avatars. And certainly it's also possible to do this outside of VR too. Here's a user that sees from a viewpoint of a camera attached to their waist, and as my postdoc Jun Nishida found out, users not only see from that height of a child, but their behavior is somewhat transformed into childlike behavior too. These devices do all of this by only tricking our optical sense. But as this integration moves from the user's senses into the user's actuators, like their muscles, self-perception might change even more because we can now also manipulate self-action. Let me give an example. In one of my early projects using muscle stimulation, I created a variation of a popular children's game called Red Hands or Slapsies. Two people have to sort of slap each other's hands and one has to tuck away really fast. But here you play alone, in which case your voluntary hand is trying to avoid being slapped by your involuntary hand. That involuntary hand is controlled by means of muscle stimulation. It's not under your control. When participants tried this out, they reported a sense of blurred ownership, sometimes referring to their computer-controlled hand as part of their body, and sometimes to an external interactive device that they just played a game with. And this is even more evident as we start to give users abilities beyond their biological capacity. For instance, here in this project last Kai, we used muscle stimulation to accelerate someone's reaction time so much that they were able to take a picture of this very fast-moving baseball by means of the muscle stimulation doing the picture for them. And so this is kind of an interesting case because our intuition would tell us that the sense of agency, the feeling of I did this, is totally immutable. And so when I voluntarily do an action, I feel all my agency. But if I'm assisted by muscle stimulation to do an action faster than humanly possible, especially than my own humanly possible, I should feel no agency. But our findings were quite different. In fact, what we found out in this study last Kai is that users actually felt completely in control of actions that they only performed faster by means of muscle stimulation. In fact, there are many other interesting devices out there that have a capability of doing actions for the user or with the user, such as extra limbs that hold tools for you, or muscle stimulation that makes you operate a tool that you've never seen before, or a tail that automatically balances your body. Now, these exhibits varying levels of agency, from user-driven things to mixed initiative, such as, things that might make you feel like I did this, or something that is more mixed initiative that might feel like this helped me to do it. And we think this is a really grand open challenge for devices that have the ability to control the user's body. How will you as a designer create tools that have this feeling and this permeable feeling of user and device agents? How will you even regulate this user and device agency, and how you ensure that the user is always in control? Now, what is striking about the perception of self is that it's also influenced by how others see us. And as such, there's another open challenge here to examine the perception of integrated devices on others, right? Not just on myself. For example, how will others perceive you if you have this interactive tail that our co-author Dog made, right? And in fact, some researchers such as Christian Holtz and his colleagues have explicitly looked at how users of mock-up implanted devices felt as they walked around with the devices around bystanders. And this is a real key challenge to deepen our understanding of the future of these devices, not just to look at the user, but also at the other users around them. So let me summarize what this paper is trying to do. We're trying to present grand challenges that we derive by looking at HCI as integration rather than interaction. And we cluster these in 4 categories that you can see right here, such as human-compatible technology, identity and behavior, integration in society, where we dive into a lot of the ethical challenges, and designing for integrated interfaces, where we dive into a lot of how you transmit information between user and device if you can't use, for instance, visuals. Now, I did not go into all of them. I want to emphasize this is sort of the type of paper that is just meant to be read and dissected and disagreed with. As a paper co-authored by 26 people, I guarantee you I also don't agree with all the perspectives in it. And we really meant this paper as a conversation starter. Now, if you find yourself saying HCI by meaning something else than our existing HCI acronym and you're getting confused between integration and interaction, don't worry. We're not trying to overload this very useful term that we already have. In fact, most of the co-authors in this paper refer to human-computer integration as HINT, rather than HCI. Now, of course, some of us, like myself, went all the way with it when I decided to call my HCI lab the Human Computer Integration Lab. And so we're also just trying to provoke more researchers to consider what perspective they're taking at every moment when they're doing their research, and that perhaps sometimes considering users and devices as one integrated entity might give them new challenges and new ideas to work on. Now, lastly, I want to thank all my amazing co-authors. There are too many to name, but you can see their names right here on this slide, with a special thanks to Floyd, Jonathan Gruden, and Patty Moss, who really brought us together to write this paper after our initial doctoral meeting. With this, I'm here. I'd love to take your questions. If we're running too much out of time, as Ben said, you can also type them in the chat box and I'll just go at it.
Great. Thank you, Pedro. That was a pretty cool talk. So I think we can go over a little bit our original schedule. It's one of these things where, our second session, I believe, has one fewer talk, so we have a little bit of leeway here. So let's see. I think Sarah has a question. Sarah?
Yeah, I had a quick question about how you think about devices that have a lot of agency themselves, like robots or interactive bots or virtual agents, and how much of those might have a play with the human-computer integration as opposed to the interaction, and whether you think those type of devices or agents will stay more in the interaction side, or whether you think that they can also integrate with the human body.
An awesome question, and the HRI angle had to come from you. That's very, very cool. So that's actually one funny one, and reading the paper will give you a different answer, or asking any of my 25 co-authors will give you a different answer, probably 25 different answers. And this is where I disagree with some of us, and I disagree with our paper, which is I actually find there's some necessity for me to call something integration that it is indistinguishable from a part of the human body. And so if the device is not using part of your body, I don't think it's really integrated, at least with you. It might be integrated with society, with the environment, and so forth. And so for me, in my part of the paper, essentially, I kind of would claim that necessity to be in the body is a prerequisite for the integration. And as such, robots, unless exoskeletons and so forth, they're not integrated. That being said, many of my co-authors disagreed with me, and they actually called precisely these robotic accompaniments and companion species that just work with you and have a lot of agency, and sometimes mixed agency too, because they won't do it without your initiative and so forth. They call them integrated interfaces. So I think it's up for debate what this actually is. From my perspective, we kind of require that bodily function to be integrated. This is a really good question.
Yeah, thank you.
Cool. Dan Bennett had a question. I unmuted Dan. Dan, you want to just go ahead now?
Dan.
Oh, sorry. Maybe I didn't unmute him correctly, but I'm trying to.
That's great. Hi there. Really love the talk, and I'm really particularly interested in the stuff you've been doing in this and a few other papers, thinking about agency in integration. And one thing I always think about when agency comes up in HCI is that we talk a lot about kind of, and I think your work generally focuses on this too, this kind of sense of control, the feeling of having controlled a process. I just wondered whether there's anything in the paper, I've not had a chance to look yet, and a distinction to be drawn between this sense of control, agency, and a broader sense of autonomy, sort of the sense of self-governance, because quite a lot of the issues we have now around, say, dark patterns and things are more issues of self-governance, and obviously they potentially become more concerning when perhaps even via the sense of self-control being overridden is a bit of a funny word there, but that's perhaps a vector for more of those issues.
Yeah, Dan, I'm 100% with you on that one, because you're right. And I think precisely the reason why in my papers I try to use the sense of agency, in fact, I use two things and try to distinguish them too: sense of agency and the sense of ownership, right? These are very different things as well. I might feel agency of something, but I might feel, or have agency over something, but I might not feel that that's part of my body. And that happens a lot with these integrated devices, is that some score really well on agency and they score terribly on ownership and sense of feeling they're actually integrated as part of my body. They come with me and they respond when I want, and others the other way around. But then to top the whole thing off, you're totally right. And that's, I think, why we ended up not using sense of governing. And we do talk about a little bit of that in the ethical section part of the paper when we discuss how these devices might be used in sort of dark patterns of integration. And then we don't mean agency. We mean exactly the same as you mean with sense of governance. And I think that is above all of it. And that's regardless of whether it's just an interface that you've integrated with, or that you're interacting with, or one that controls you, and so forth, so forth. I think you're on point. And in fact, later on today, I mean, Marshni is going to chair one of the sessions, and she knows tons about that. And she, in fact, authored a couple of papers on dark patterns. So if you can stick in the line, you might hear more from her on that note. This is a great question.
Great, thank you. So I think we probably have to move on, but let's take in one last question from Rain Ashford. Rain, you want to ask? I think you're unmuted.
Yeah, I think you've unmuted me. Hi, Pedro. Hey, fantastic talk. Yes, nice to see you again. My research is around like nonverbal communication and personalization of wearable devices, and I just wondered how personalization, i.e. self-expression through aesthetic choices, could or might be developed when any early devices would probably be confined to a certain set of materials, for example, interface choices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're striking a perfect point right there, because a huge section of this paper, and in fact the one that starts this biocompatibility discussion that I presented here, but I chopped off in the interest of time, starts with personalization. Who wrote that is Martin Weigel, in case you want to reach out to Martin and just get really geeky with him on this. But what Martin is arguing in that section of the paper is essentially that personalization of wearable devices is almost like a mandatory step to get to an integrated device, right? First of all, bodies are all different. There's no one size fit all and so forth. And then I think, maybe I'm speaking too much for Martin, but I think what Martin is saying as well is that ultimately it's almost like only the user can customize the device for their own body. We're going to reach like a little weird point down the line of personalization that nobody can personalize but you. And that's a really interesting step, which then also gets into your topic, which is, okay, and if I designed a transfer of information, especially if it's nonverbal, there might be points as well where the user kicks in again and says, like, let me customize how this device is going to talk to my muscles, to my body, to my sense of auditory, to my sense of this and that. And so I think personalization is going to play a huge role, and it's really a field out for grabs for new papers and new developments in HCI, honestly.
Cool. Thank you very much. Can't wait to read the paper.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
All right, great. Thanks, everybody. So that concludes the first session of our symposium today. So